people drive up that ribbon of gravel and they're looking at these two churches, I mean, obviously it's a dramatic juxtaposition of two buildings, which is rather unique. I don't think you'll find this more than in a few places in all of the United States. And so the first question is, how did this happen? What are the eras and how did the communities intersect to make this happen? And as an historian, I'm really caught up in sort of what would you call the various visions. Obviously there was a vision to create the first church in 1862, the old stone church. But then even more importantly, the vision to establish the wood clapboard steepled church in 1894. But why position them only 75 feet apart, facing each other? So there was an interesting vision there. The third vision is that the Preservation Society was developed when the congregation dissolved in 1973. And there was this vision, how do we preserve this site? How do we take care of it? And what should we interpret and explain to the community? So we have all these new communities, and since 1973, even more developments. A new vision came about when in 2001, the Preservation Society, through a massive effort in 6 months, raised over $400,000. There was hundreds of people who donated funds to buy over 110 acres. It's amazing. And so this idea of interpreting the land and the site has created a new vision for the Preservation Society. So all these intersecting communities, to me, are just fascinating. And when you look at each era, well, how did we get to that next milestone? That's what's fascinating. But there's always been people invested in this site for one reason or another, and it thrives because of that. So the congregation, primarily made up of Norwegian American immigrants in the 1850s, so right around 1855, 56, they had been holding outdoor services in the summer and fall at people's homes, sometimes in people's homes. But by 1860, there was a push that let's build a church. But then 1 year later, 1861, the Civil War erupts. And so that was sort of put on hold. At the same time, we also have Holden Congregation, which is sort of the mother church of all these small rural Norwegian American churches. And they're building the large parsonage for the founder of this, Bernt Julius Moose. And so things are put on hold, so they decide to build this church. So the church was erected in 1862, and if you know your history, I mean, we're already a year into the war. Within Minnesota, we're having huge, essentially a war with the Dakota Sioux over treaty rights, land rights. So can you imagine being in this congregation and you have young men signing up? For instance, Halvor Quee, who's over there, who's the grandfather of our former governor, Al Quee. Well, Halvor Quee had read that a man was coming to Northfield who would sign people up to be in his sharpshooter unit. So several young men from this congregation went to Northfield, and apparently they were good sharpshooters, so they all ended up being enlisted in that group. And so imagine they're off to war, and their family's at home here, and they're coming to church, and they're praying for all these young men who are off in battle. So there's a lot going on in 1862. Because of that, the church is not even dedicated until 1868. I'm just amazed when you look at it. I mean, it's simple in design. It's sort of Greek revival, I guess, would be the architectural style. People would look at it and maybe dismiss it. Well, it's just a simple shed almost. So a few things about it. So the foundation in this church is actually made out of rubble limestone that was quarried over in the big woods. So you had all these local elements. The people here are going to create their own church, and they get the stone out of the big woods. Right now you see there's a limestone stucco over top of the limestone rubble blocks. You'll also notice that there's these sort of inscribed mortar inscriptions where they try to make it look like real dressed brick. And then at the top, you have a finial with a rooster on top that spins around. This finial, if you look at photos from the 1890s, you can see a faint outline of the rooster. And then in 2008, the Preservation Society started reworking the steeple on this old building, the old stone church. And while they were in the roof, they found a plank with a sort of crude drawing of a rooster. And in Norwegian it said, "This is how you do it." So here's the carpenter telling the workmen, this is how you make the finial for this church. And the Preservation Society said, well, we got something here. So there was a finial, was a rooster, and why not recreate it? So John Mockestead, who had been one of the early founders of the Preservation Society, he was enlisted to sort of really draw a nice rooster, and then from his drawing, using computer software, they were able to create I suppose, like a blueprint that they gave to a firm in Faribault, Lockerbie Sheet and Metal. And Lockerbie was able to fabricate the rooster per John's drawing, and there it is. So, what a beautiful little old building it is. There's so many stories, and that's just one milestone as we move across the lawn to the wood church. Yeah. The congregation was getting so large that they needed new space. So they built this in 1894, and they also built another one in town. And the congregation sort of just, separated at that point. And this church here, the 1894 church, would serve the congregation out in the country until 1973. The church bell, as I mentioned earlier, and why it's not in this tower, but there is one over there, it originally was housed in the old stone church belfry. Purchased in 1874 from a foundry in Troy, New York, at a cost of over $500. This 1,400-pound bell was shipped to Nerstrand, and so 20 years later, when this church is built, well, how are you going to get the bell over there? I like to think of history as being alive and around you, so you can just picture it, these draft horses pulling the ropes and pulleys and men hoisting that bell up to get it up there. The bell itself, if you go up there, it's got a beautiful tone. And I've talked to people that grew up in this area, and they'd said in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, if you were at home doing chores or out in the garden weeding or whatever, and all of a sudden you'd hear the church bell ring slowly and methodically, you knew it was for a funeral. And you also knew how old the person was, so they would ring it for every year of the person's life. So the young children would count, oh, that was 72 rings. But that meant so much to people in the community because you could hear it for so far and so long. So that's just beautiful, that bell story. For the longest time, there was this one pastor serving it, Nils Quammen. In fact, he served the church from I get my dates right, about 1867 to about 1908, so quite a tenure. But he was residing over at, as I said, Christiana, that at one point in the early years, there was a spring melt and the creeks were flowing heavy, and he couldn't get across with his horse. So you know what he did? He went to a farmer and asked if he could use the pig trough. And he paddled his way over the stream to come here to preach. In 1911, the congregation purchased an organ, a pump organ, from a firm in St. Louis, Missouri. And it was quite an expensive organ. It was over $1,000, which in 1911, quite a bit of funds. There's interesting stories about it over the years. As you had to pump it, and the pump was sort of behind the organ, and it was a small little space, they would enlist children, usually one child, to be in there in service and be in this little cubby hole and to pump it. Kids would become drowsy, I suppose, maybe not listening to the preacher, but so these hand-pumping kids would fall asleep inside the cubby, and the organist going to get their sound. By 1970 or so, agriculture and family life has changed radically. We've become more industrialized, more urban. People are just not farming and having large families anymore, and that's what the church sort of supported, was large farming families. They were down to 17 families in the congregation by 1972. And a decision was made at the Easter service, should we keep going or dissolve? And the congregation voted we should dissolve. And so they said, we'll wait 1 year, and then at Easter in 1973, that'll be the last service. So all those years up until 73, and then it was at that point Preservation Society was formed, and said, well, let us be the caretakers of the wood church. The Cemetery Association was given the stone church to maintain, and it wasn't until 2005 that the association then gave, for $1, the church to be maintained to the Preservation Society. And so now the whole site is maintained and preserved by the society, including the land. You know. By the 1990s, you see sort of new volunteers coming on board, new ideas. They start holding festivals in the summer. There had been concerts given in the church itself, but you start seeing more emphasis on bringing in a wider community. More grants are being awarded. Things are being done to the church. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the Christmas Eve service. It's just an endearing program to those in the Northfield and larger community know about. So from like 1995 on, you find that they have a Christmas Eve service. And it's more of just a gathering and to celebrate what the season's about. It's now, I gather, standing room only if you can get a spot. I asked John once, tell me about a Christmas Eve service that really meant something to you, that could be defined as an epiphany moment. Or he said, well, he really didn't know that much about Valley Grove or its Christmas Eve service, but he was asked to come and do a service here, and he said, there was a light snow in the air, and he was driving down the country road there, and there's these big candles in the windows, and the church is, it's dark, but these lights are just glowing, and he said, it was almost surreal, the beauty that was emanating, and then to pull up, and everyone in there is excited, and it's warm and welcoming, and there's cookies, and he said he was sold. This was his place where he felt comfortable doing that. To honor the heritage and the legacy of these Norwegian American farmers that built this place, singing Norwegian hymns and really trying not to recreate what the 19th century was, but to honor that, if you were coming off the road, this is stepping back in time. Yeah. There really is a lot of modern conveniences up here. Yeah. It's a beautiful fall evening, and this woman and her daughter apparently drove up. They didn't even realize Valley Grove was here, but they were just driving through the country. There was candles in all the windows of the old stone church. And she said they were just flickering, and the sky was just that, sort of the late evening dusk where the sky was beautiful shades of pink and those autumn colors, and the clouds were billowing. It was just beyond serene and bucolic. She thought, well, why not? We'll stop. So they came up the drive, and they parked, and they watched, and they assumed it was a wedding. There was many people on the lawn. And then she said, all of a sudden, and she said she will hope to never forget this, 4 little girls in frilly white dresses came prancing out of the stone church and were sort of dancing on the lawn. And she said they were like fireflies in the night. And she said, quote, it was a magical evening and one that I never want to forget. Valley Grove is magical. If you look closely and just let it envelope you, you will find that same magic. And I think for over 160 plus years, that case has been true.
I know we're looking at limestone, but the thing about the stone church is that it's very hard to see the limestone because it's been almost completely cemented over. So what looks like bricks is actually a bunch of painted on lines on cement. And there are only a few places, and this is one of them, where you can see down through the cement to what the rock is underneath that the church is made out of. Those are chunks of limestone. It's called the Platteville, and it is perfect for making buildings because it never gets very thick. And all over the landscape around here, you'll find places where people in the 19th century quarried out the Platteville limestone. They didn't really need any special tools at all. The Platteville is, in fact, exposed in the valley that's just south of here between the churches and Nerstrand in the scientific and natural area. So there's a waterfall in that valley that's on the Platteville, the hidden falls in Nerstrand Park, and the little falls down here in this stream. It's very widespread in this area. I love taking students out to this part of the county because it looks nothing like Northfield does. And it's astonishing to them that there's hills, for one thing. And with the prairie restoration and the old churches here and the history, this is just a wonderful place to think about the relationship between people and the landscape. First day we come out here, I take them to the cemetery here for a couple reasons. One is that the tombstones go back quite a ways. And so another thing that's, you can tell from the stone church, it says 1862. But some of the gravestones are right from that same period. And they tell some stories about the Norwegian immigration. The stones are in Norwegian. And then the other thing, and this is kind of a standard geology, is to look at the rocks that compose the headstones and figure out which rocks are most susceptible to weathering and erosion and which ones stand up through the centuries. And the general idea is if you want your tombstone to be preserved forever and ever and ever, make it out of granite. Don't make it out of marble. I usually have the students try to find what the oldest tombstones are and try to sort out, if they can, who is the oldest immigrant that came over from Norway. If they can figure out what the birth date was from the tombstones. We usually stop in the restored prairie, and I usually have a corer with me, and so we dig down about 1 meter to take a look at the soil and the material that the soil is formed on. Soils around here, especially in this part of the county, are exceptionally rich because they're formed on glacial silt, ground up and deposited by wind. So there's more than 1 meter of soil derived from windblown silt. Got a beautiful prairie soil on top of it, which is deep black and very thick. We don't have very good methods for dating things that are of that age. It's kind of between 200,000 and a couple million years. Radiocarbon dating doesn't work that far back, so we don't actually know exactly what the ages are, except very old. And once the younger glaciations come in, and the younger glaciers did not cover this area right where we are at Valley Grove, we got a better idea of what the dates are for those, and the most recent one was 14,000 years ago. And if you think about the Cannon River, which runs south to north, the Cannon River was approximately, not exactly, but approximately the eastern margin of the most recent ice sheet 14,000 years ago. So we're east of that, and the glacial material that we see around here, and it's material that's below that windblown silt, is probably from that glaciation, very widespread glaciation that we're tentatively thinking is around 600,000 years.
have been using these kind of skills as a naturalist tracker. And by tracking, I mean in identifying and interpreting the things left behind. Because most of the time, you don't see wildlife so much as see what they leave behind. The evidences that they leave behind tell you a lot about their behavior and give you a chance to interpret what the animal's doing. That's a 13-line ground squirrel plunge hole right in the middle of that. They really like this short grass, and they'll run through it. And there's little plunge holes where they empty the dirt someplace else, so that if they're running along on one of their little trails, they just disappear down that hole. And so this guy's got a little hole right here that almost drops straight down for a ways. There's an acorn that he's been chewing. This was all prairie and savanna and woodland around here, and there weren't many conifers. So conifers are a good winter cover, and they're a good windbreak. And it's often a place where owls and hawks will roost. And there's an owl pellet right here. Owl pellets, more than hawk pellets, will tell you a lot about what they've been eating. And here's the jaw of a meadow vole. This is the lower leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. You know, knowing some anatomy and comparative anatomy with vertebrates will tell you a lot about what it's eating. With hawk, they dissolve almost everything. So much more difficult with hawk pellets, and usually I can tell if it's a hawk pellet just by picking it up, because if you squeeze it and it feels spongy and doesn't feel like it's got much bone material in it, almost surely a hawk. You can kind of see where the vegetation changes a little bit and where things start to flower out there. 4 species of liatris that we have here. This may be called gay flower or something, but it has a real tight, dense inflorescence that comes up, and it has tiny little flowers that bloom all the way along that column. Bright purple or bright pink, and one of the things that the butterflies really come to. This is gray-headed coneflower, monarda. So this is just starting to bloom. And it's got kind of it's a legume, so it's got a little legume-like flower on it. They're almost tree-like, and they get these big pods on them where the flowers are. And after they dry down a little bit, they break off right at the base. And then they'll tumble across the prairie, and they'll collect other plants, other baptisia like that. And sometimes you'll see a ball of them, almost like a tumbleweed, you know. And so that's the way that the seeds are distributed. They tumbleweed themselves across the prairie, and the shells of these pods open up and scatter the seed as the wind takes it around. Sometimes you'll find clusters of these things at tree lines or on the fence line, something like that.
This area, Northfield, Nerstrand, in this area, was on the edge of the transition zone from woods to prairie. So the habitats are kind of intermingled and interspersed, and so there's a lot of border territory here. So what makes it really interesting is many habitats exist right along in these zones, and they're all close together. And so, for example, on this site, we have a beautiful oak savanna. When you get back there, you'll see some huge oak trees that are probably upwards of several hundred years old that represent the old oak savanna. But away from that area is prairie. There's also wetlands. So the plan for restoring this site is to restore the oak savanna. We've got the trees, but we need to bring back kind of the grasses and the openness of the oak savanna. And we have the concept of a corridor, which is a wider area that is conserved, not necessarily as one giant block, but as an area that is mixed use inside of it, but with an overall area that provides habitat for some of our animals and insects that need a larger space. And so we can still have farm and other kinds of things going on. But between the concept that we're working with here is that between Nerstrand Woods State Park and Prairie Creek Wildlife Management Area Kester Unit on the north end, we can make a wildlife corridor that between state lands, privately restored lands, and other lands will create that habitat that's going to support some of those creatures that need bigger habitats, particularly raptors, birds need that greater size habitat. A place like Valley Grove inspires that and connects you with the infinite, in part because from that site in particular, you can see what this area looked like during the settlement era, and it's not too hard to see in your mind's eye what it looked like pre-settlement. And so you're connecting with waves of time and the passage of time in that way, as well as, you know, I'm a descendant of settlers, and I can connect with my settler history very easily from that site, as well as just seeing the two churches there, and I get a feeling of comfort when I see that. But I think there is a spirit among the people that live in and near this corridor or appreciate the beauty of it to say, this is a landscape that really needs to be preserved because it contributes so much to our understanding of who we are and our place in time.
One of the profound things about this spot right now is the intimacy of the woods and the space of the prairie and the sky right here. And when you stand here and you look out and kind of survey miles around, this is one of the high points. And I can drive quite far that way and I can see the steeple. So this was chosen by geography and importance in this spot by these Norwegian settlers here. One of the things about space is that right now, tonight, the atmosphere is soft and has a blue sheen to it, and everything is slightly out of focus. It just creates a beauty. It creates, the sunlight diffuses through it, and with the flowers and the things around here that have been so lovingly planted and cared for, it is a place beyond words. 53 years that I've been coming to this area and this spot. And at that time, I did not have beauty as an art concept in my art. So when I looked at the landscape, I started to see things that I had never seen before. When you jump out of Holocaust images and all the things I was doing to going with love and beauty, I think it's meant to shake us. I think beauty is meant to just be absolutely breathtaking and overwhelming. And that's what happened to me as I wandered around trying to figure out, who am I as an artist? But little by little, I started to open up what was surrounding me, and who would have known that I would make a career out of wandering in the woods and coming home with wet shoes all the time and, you know, hanging out at Two-Step Falls. One of the things that surprised me early in my career was to look at something, not just naming it, but it was a certain color. Color has been my passion. Color is one of the things I'm known for in my career. And so one of the things that I love is this blue stem prairie grass that's glowing red all over. This prairie with the green foreground here, and then these amazing yellow prairie flowers that are on the edge, and that mystery of color. It's beyond words for me. One day I saw a lady get out of her car and walk, and I knew who she was going to water the flowers for, her family member, and she was heading over. And I watched her with her water bucket, and she went by the Feldmans right here. They lost 3 children, and they have a bird bath there. And she filled the bird bath up on the way over to do her mom, dad's place over here. And I was just going, look at the tender, sweet things that are happening here of caring and seeing the value of this place and the relationships of lives.
This is my favorite place probably to paint. It's just as tranquil and as peaceful as probably anywhere on the planet. You can come up here most of the time and it's quiet, it's peaceful, and it is so tremendously kind of iconic of the settlers and the people who lived here, and it's kind of like a visual history, I think, of our valley and our place that we live. So I painted several pictures. I probably painted 20 pictures of Valley Grove, but when Pat died, I wasn't sure what to do, and I just thought, I love Valley Grove, so I came and I bought a plot and I designed that stone, and here it is. And this is one of the most peaceful places I know, and notice my name is on it too, so I'll be here. You're just surrounded by beauty. Winter, it's as beautiful in the winter as it is in the summer, and the fall and the spring, it's constantly beautiful. So they picked a good spot. It just tells a story. And it's here, in the middle of the great woods and the prairie. It just tells this great story, and I, as an artist, I try to tell the story every time I paint a picture of it. Once you come out here and wander around a little bit, I think it just kind of, you become part of the whole history, I think. You start feeling it. And you feel all these people that were here before, they had their hopes and dreams and their plans and their lives, and they're here too, their spirits. An encompassing feeling that you're among friends, you're not alone.
Project this evening is to plant native wildflower seedlings, several of which pollinators love, so it could be called a pollinator booster mix in an area along the edge of the cemetery that has been troublesome to seed in using our prior methods of seeding. But the particular area we're working on this evening has been troublesome. Weeds have taken over, weedy grasses and sort of weedy annual plants, and have gone kind of dominant. They make a lot of seed, the seed stays in the soil over winter, and the next year the same thing happens. So the native prairie seed that we put in 2 and 3 years ago is overwhelmed, has become overwhelmed by the weedy annuals. So we're trying to tip the game in favor of the native wildflowers by suppressing the annuals and then using some mulching methods to give the prairie natives the edge in the competition. And if all goes well, we'll have a population of nearly 200, and we may plant another 100 tomorrow morning. So 300 mixed native wildflowers that pollinators love, monarch butterflies and others, and the bees as well, of course. So we're kind of forcing the process of giving the native wildflowers the edge. So we're trying to tip the scale in the favor of the natives.
My wife and I live 2 miles away as the crow flies on a farm, and members of our family who have passed away are buried just over there, so we have a personal connection both to the church. We know Gary, and we love prairie restorations, and like to be out here helping out.
My ancestors are buried here, and I've been thinking a lot lately about the people who came here, who lived here before my ancestors, and not just the people, but the animals and plants, and so I'd like to restore some of that was taken away.
Well, we're good friends with the Wagenbachs, and we were visiting with them one day. We come out to church here on every July 4th, and we just love this area.
Oh, I did have 4.
And so we thought we would help and do what we can to improve the native grasses and plants and make it even more special.
I love the prairie. I want to see it be developed into more like what we're seeing out here. I'd like to see more things happening. They've done quite a bit to remove what was in here. The daylilies were awful to try and get out of here, and now it'd be wonderful to get some prairie plantings in here with a few flowers here and there during the summer.
We have some connections here. We have a daughter buried up in the cemetery, and we live about a 1.5 miles north of the church, so I see the church every morning and every night before I go to bed. We spend a lot of time up here walking around on the prairie, and we just love to be out here. We try to spend as much time out here as possible, and anything we can do to make it better when we come out for ourselves and for everybody else would be great.
I have organized a group of volunteers to spray herbicide on invading ash and cottonwood trees in our restoration prairie planting, and so they're out putting a small amount of herbicide on the little leafy sprouts of the trees that we don't want in the prairie, and then I'm going around looking for an invading Asian relative of sweet clover called bird's foot trefoil, and so then I put a little bit of herbicide on the bird's foot trefoil. It has spread into our native prairie plantings along trails from mowing or people walking, and so to enhance the native grasses and wildflowers in our prairie plantings, we suppress some of those that have been introduced from other continents.
It's 57 acres. A lot of times we say 50 acres. Is try to bring it back to what those early Norwegian immigrants saw. And like Gary, I'm of 100% Norwegian background, so or heritage. But my wife and I retired to this area approximately 10 years ago, and we were just out driving around. We saw these 2 steeples up on a hill, and we thought we got to check that out. And as soon as we drove up the lane and I got out of the car, we just knew it was a special place. And then pretty soon both Gary and I are Minnesota Master Naturalist volunteers, and one of the classes, Gary Wagenbach was the instructor, and I must have mentioned something about it, and he said, "Oh, you should come and sit in on one of our board meetings." Well, I was hooked. So,
Glyphosate.
yeah.
I don't have
Boy, oh boy.
Did you put the
I'm Gloria Reinhold, Editor-in-Chief of the Norwegian American, North America's oldest and only Norwegian newspaper, in existence since 1889. When I drove up here today, I felt like I was driving into another time and place with this stunning vista. And then you come inside and you feel like you're being transported back in time to experience this sense of calmness and peacefulness that the Norwegian immigrants must have felt when they came here for Sunday services. I'm very impressed with the work that the historical groups here are doing to restore the churches and preserve this for the present generation and future generations.
I love this place. I have to say, this is one of my favorite places in Minnesota. And I am also a Nordic folk musician, and some of my best memories are playing music out under that beautiful oak tree that stood for so long. I just feel like there's a very special feeling here, and it brings people together, whether you're Norwegian American or a Rice County person or a visitor. Everyone feels welcome here.
I have been out here for many years as a visitor, and I think so many people are taken with the beauty and the history and then the serenity of this location. It is just gorgeous. Partly the iconic churches facing one another like an younger and older sibling. The cemetery has fascinating history in it. And then looking south over the prairie and the oak savanna to Nerstrand Big Woods State Park, it's all here. And so coming out here in the spring, in the summer, the fall, of course the colors, and then the winter is just beautiful. So as a board member, I absolutely signed on saying, I want to support this, I want to do what I can do to help keep this place going, because it's been here a long time and it deserves all the tender, loving care that it receives. Well, I'm very keen on the idea of place and a sense of place. I have always felt very strongly about belonging to this area, to southern Minnesota. I grew up in the Twin Cities, but I was attracted to Northfield 50-some years ago. And I just think this landscape is so powerful. And here at Valley Grove, you really see the best of what southern Minnesota has to offer. And particularly after the Preservation Society acquired the property to the south, east, and west of the cemetery to recreate the prairie and the oak savanna. It really speaks strongly to the ecosystems in southern Minnesota, the big woods, the prairie, the sort of glacial terrain, and all of that is, I think, is just really beautiful, and I see that and appreciate that whenever I come out here.
This is a tapestry, and it's done in the style of historic Norwegian tapestry, ones that may have been done from in the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s, in that I'm using a design, a border of animals around a central figure, but also common to historical Norwegian tapestries are often no slits. So there are decorative joins that cover the vertical areas, and the historic Norwegian tapestries tend to have areas of solid color rather than a lot of hachure or blending and so on. So these brightly colored, bright saturated colored tapestries are going to be in the old stone church. And this one has a border of animals that are common to or significant for the area around Valley Grove churches and Northfield. For example, we have a Holstein here because Northfield was known for its Holsteins. It has a sign saying cows, colleges, and contentment, so the Holstein is necessary. Some animals are wild animals. Here's a beaver, the deer is coming, and the pocket gopher was very important in digging up in the prairies. There's a Polish China pig, a variety that was well known in the area, a badger. Badgers are coming back. And there's a brush wolf or a coyote, a rabbit, and river otter. And I love the idea of the DNR and other people working to bring the river otters back to the streams of southern Minnesota in that area around Nerstrand. So the palette of yarn is, I can't say it's completely traditional to any one particular old Norwegian tapestry, but the golds, reds, blues, rusts, browns, those would all be found in the old tapestries. And even though the images will be quite different, the sizes of the 4 tapestries will be the same, and there will be different amounts of colors in the various tapestries. In Norwegian tapestry, we don't use bobbins to hold the yarn when you put it in. You make butterflies. They're just small butterflies that you wind. And so you're working on the small areas and let them hang as you are not using them. I love the graveyard, and I love all the stones, especially the really old ones. I actually really love the fact that there are very modern graves there too. They're very poignant. And but there are at least 12 gravestones that use this Victorian clasped hand image. And so I thought, well, I should get that in one of them. But when you're weaving, you have to figure out, well, how big do I have to make something in order to weave it in a lovely way at the set that you're using, the number of ends per inch. And I think this clasped hand looks pretty nice, and it's gonna show up in one of the other tapestries. The first of the 4 Valley Grove tapestries is off the loom, and while there are lots of messy ends on the back that will be fixed, it's ready to hang up and view in the setting that it will eventually be in. And we hoped that it would make a bright statement in that space, and I think it's working pretty well in that way. So the whole project is a set of tapestries, a set of 4 tapestries for the old stone church that will celebrate the immigrants, the flora, the fauna, and the built environment here at Valley Grove churches. So while it's not going to be specifically divided into 4, the first tapestry includes a number of animals that were important to the area, and one of the bur oak trees, because the
The churches border on an oak savanna prairie, and that's an important part of the Valley Grove Preservation Society's work, is to maintain this prairie and to encourage it. So the bur oak tree that's the centerpiece of this first tapestry is in honor of the oak savanna that surrounds the churches. And the living tapestry aspect is what I've tried to do in planning these four, because it will never be a perfect didactic history of everything that has happened, or every animal that's most important, or every bird, or every flower, but things will be representative, and it will be representative of the flora of all of the plants that are important to natural history of the area, and the animals, and also honoring the people that are a part of it, and the built environment, the actual churches, and some gravestones that people have seen over time. That's another thread, that those gravestones have been there since the 1800s, and the same people, and people see them all the time.
He's up in the sky. He's up in the sky. Yeah.